This is episode 13 of season 1 of Babylon 5, Signs and Portents. This is going to be a deeply long one. This is a full-on raging arc episode. Strap yourselves in, sit comfortably and pay attention. Signs and Portents is the name of this first season as a whole. So this is quite a significant episode because it lends its name to the season. So I'm going to go full double think on this one and just pretend like I know nothing apart from what has got on to date, okay? It also has a nice JMS commentary on my DVD set. It was nice to hear his voice again. And I've discovered that the name of the composer is Christopher Frank E. I've only just found that out 20 odd years later. I just thought it was Christopher Frank up to this point. I thought the E was silent. So there you go. Go! Alright, breathe. Let's go. It is Wednesday, the 3rd of August, 22:58 at 4:30 a.m. Spot on. That's when Ivanova's alarm goes off. And apparently she has the taste of old carpet in her mouth. And her Alexa is very, very polite, and it says that she wants to make a medical inquiry out of that. and Ivanova just goes, ugh. So she makes it onto the bridge, the command and control centre, and she complains that she always has trouble waking up when it's dark, to which Sinclair points out that it's always dark in space, and of course that's her problem. The first thing that happens is that an SOS comes in from a lone Star Fury, and he's on the run, basically. His escort was jumped by raiders, and he seems to be the only survivor left, and he's completely outnumbered and outgunned. Sinclair orders Deltawing to be scrambled to try and help him, but it's far too late for that, and he's destroyed, even as I think he's trying to eject. So, it's apparent that the raiders are still a real problem, and that's going to get looked at this episode. We also have a new arrival on the station. And we see a nice interior shot of the sort of arrivals bay with various ships docked up. And it turns out that this gentleman has been on the rim for some time, which is the extreme reaches of the known area of the galaxy. And when the security guard asks him why he's been out there for so long, whether or not he found anything, he says that yes, he found something interesting, and doesn't expand on that, and then goes about his business. So, in his office, Sinclair is discussing the raiders with his command staff, and despite having cut their ties to the Narn for heavy weapons, they're still able to hit very hard, and they're also moving much faster than they think that they should be able to. And the attacks are getting closer and closer to the station, and Sinclair is understandably concerned about providing safe passage for ships coming to the station. He orders that Deltawing be put on sort of hot standby so they can respond very quickly if there's another attack. And Garibaldi notes that while Ivanova's suggestion of compiling a list of likely targets is wise, those ships don't always log what they're actually going to be carrying. And Sinclair very sensibly says, well, that's on them. So basically, if they're not going to tell us what they're carrying, then we can't help them. Which, fair enough. And as Ivanova goes off to man her Star Fury, Sinclair asks Garibaldi for help, and he asks him to be a friend. There's a nice sort of 360-degree pan here as Sinclair paces around Garibaldi as he's talking to him, and he arrives back face to face with him. And he asks him for help to put together his missing 24 hours from the line, given that, as we've seen in the previous episodes recently, he's uncovered certain things about that period of time, but not everything. And of course, Garibaldi's more than happy to help, and he's grateful that Sinclair trusted him enough to bring him in and ask him. In one of the bars on the station, Londo is waiting for a very important delivery, and finally the merchandise arrives. And the merchandise, in inverted commas, is actually the Eye, which is the oldest symbol of Centauri nobility, a piece of jewellery that belonged to the first Centauri emperor. It's a major sort of cultural item for the Centauri. It's not really clear how the guy found it, who's delivered it, as it's been lost for over 100 years. So immediately there's a mystery there. And the new arrival from the Rim is in the bar and is sort of keeping half an eye on proceedings with some interest, it seems. So as Londo is taking his item back to his quarters, he arrives at a lift, and at the same time as Jakar and a rather unfortunate human does. So this poor human ends up being the piggy in the middle between the two ambassadors. And Londo notes that there's a famine happening on the Narn homeworld. And Londo says that Jakar should take the famine as a blessing, ambassador, because it'll weed out the weaker bits of the Narn population. And it's interesting because he's suggesting that Jakar's people are doing what the Centauri did in terms of strip mining Narn in order to build their own war machine. And it's sort of both ironic and sort of hypocritical that they're both accusing each other of the same thing, and yet they are doing the same thing, but from very different perspectives, for very different reasons, of course. And Jakar uses a colourful expression towards Londo during the course of this conversation, inviting him to kiss his pouch. And it makes me wonder whether or not Narns are actually marsupials in some way, shape, or form. But he doesn't expand on that. It's not that sort of conversation. Entertainingly, the human actually manages to get into the lift in the midst of this heated debate and shuts the door on the ambassadors, who both blame the other for what's happening, for having missed the lift in exactly the same terms, and they part company in different directions. And I thought it was ironic here, because if Jakar had known what was in the box that Londo was carrying, that point would have gone very differently. But clearly he didn't on that particular day. So Sinclair has just finished telling Garibaldi what he remembers about the period when he was in the Minbari cruiser on the line, including seeing Delenn. So, he's been quite open with Garibaldi, and he says basically he doesn't know where this is going to land, and he hopes that they don't both regret having had this conversation in the first place. So, it's quite a major thing for Sinclair to have brought him in on this. But I think Sinclair realises that he's gone as far as he can go, because at the end of the day, he's not the detective, he's not the security guy. Garibaldi is, and this is right up Garibaldi's alley in terms of his skill set. So we'll see what happens with that. We now discover that the arrival from the Rim is called Mr. Morden, and he's speaking with Jakar, having been granted an audience by a senior Narn, I think in the first circle. And he asks him repeatedly, "What do you want?" Finally, Jakar responds that what he wants ultimately is justice. He wants to grind the Centauri into dust for what they did to his homeworld, and to erase them from history. And Mr. Morden asks him, and after that? And Jakar's not sure, which is telling. So there's no grand plan for him beyond securing his homeworld and making the Centauri pay for what they've done. That's his focus. Morden takes that in, and then he leaves. Outside the station, a Centauri liner is on approach and comes into dock. And Lord Kiro and Lady Ladira come on board. Kiro being, I think, a little bit more important than Londo, judging by the height of his hair. Ladira is Kiro's aunt, and his house's prophetess. And she seems to be a sort of a cross between a telepath and a seer. So she just seems to have some sort of psionic abilities, but she's also able to get glimpses of the future in visions. And she appears very disturbed shortly after her arrival onto the station, apparently fatigued, but it's more than that. And she starts talking about fire, death, pain and destruction, and the fall of the station, and then she passes out. And I noticed here that the bodyguards that come on the station with them have much, much shorter fans of hair. And Ladira has no hair at all. And if you remember in Born to the Purple, I was thinking that the length of female Centauri hair was in proportion to in inverse proportion to their sort of caste status. So I think that the high caste Centauri women have no hair, so they're completely bald, whereas the lower caste do have at least some ponytails. I also recognise the actor who's playing Kiro now. I think he played a rogue Q in Voyager. I'm pretty sure this is the same guy, but younger. And he tells Londo that apparently he will be killed by shadows. That's something that Ladira has foreseen for him. And he's very keen to see the eye, which is the symbol of his house. before giving it over to the current emperor. And as they leave to go and look at the eye, there's this sort of shot of a shady bloke who speaks into a communicator and then starts following them. So we now see that Mr. Morden has gone to visit Delenn as well. And interestingly, Delenn knows that he's been to see Jakar first as well. So clearly, just like Jakar and Londo keep tabs on each other, Delenn also keeps tabs on the other ambassadors as well. And after he's been in her quarters for a short time, a silver triangle materializes on her forehead, which Morden doesn't see. And that seems to be a reaction to his presence. And she covers it and looks back towards him. And when she does so, he seems to sort of drop into shadow. And Delenn tells him to get out. And he does so, and the triangle gradually fades away again. And it's similar to the one that we saw on the forehead of the Minbari, who was in Delenn's quarters at the end of And the Sky Full of Stars. And she's clearly very disturbed by the visit. And why she's had this reaction isn't clear. Presumably this is some form of warning device that the Grey Council have implanted in them. And Delenn says out loud that they're here. But we don't know who she means. There's no further hint beyond that, and then the scene changes. So very, very interesting. Completely different reaction, obviously, to Jakar's, and very sort of different treatment of him as well. So the scene shifts to Londo's quarters, and it seems that there are ructions in the Centauri governments, and that the population are generally unhappy. And the Emperor himself hasn't been seen for a year, leaving his Prime Minister to run things. And so consequently the Senate is losing influence. So the rediscovery of the eye is critically important for its symbolism to the Centauri as a whole. And Lord Kira, as it turns out, would quite like the top job of Emperor, and asks Londo when they lost it all. Londo responds ruefully that he doesn't know. And the eye stays with him because Kira acknowledges that if he kept hold of it, he might be tempted to do something stupid with it. So this is very interesting because you can tell that Kira has made a sort of a calculated judgment as to whether or not Londo might back him if he went for the Emperor's job, but Londo isn't really prepared to sort of go in with him one way or the other. He remains pretty neutral about it. So I think Kira knows that he's on a high road to nothing there. But it's interesting to see that Londo is clearly sort of quite mournful about the fact that the Centauri Empire is in this state in the first place. In her quarters, Ladira is hearing sort of what can only be described as echoes of the station's destruction, possibly even its self-destruction. But we don't actually see any images, so we don't know exactly what's going on there. But she's hearing a lot of noises around that. Elsewhere out in space, the transport Achilles, which can't be a good sign. It's not a great name for a transport, is it? Let's face it. And it's getting dumped by raiders. Haha, there you go. From out of nowhere. And it's burning for the jump gate, trying to stay ahead of them, and it's sending out an SOS, which is received by the station. And Sinclair launches Delta Wing with Ivanova leading the squadron. And interestingly, we see that the shifty bloke who was following Londo and Kira was back on comms again, saying that the bait's been taken. And interestingly, he says that it'll take 2 hours to reload the Cobra bays. I'm not really sure what the significance of that is, because there's more than one bay and there's more than one squadron. So I'm not quite sure why that's relevant here. But anyway, moving on. There's also Zeta Wing as well, which we saw come in the last episode. But I'm not as I say, I'm not quite sure exactly what the implications are for his statement there. So basically, you can infer from this fairly readily that he's a leader of the raiders, because clearly he knows that an attack was timed at this point and that it successfully pulled a squadron of Starfuries away from the station. Next we see Kosh's ship coming into dock, and it's going to be put into Bay 13, which I believe is its permanent home on the station. I think it's the first time we've seen it in an episode of the series, certainly. It's a rather beautiful thing. It's very smooth, it's organic, as Volon technology tends to be, and it's a smaller version of the cruiser that we saw in Deathwalker. that came through the gate. It's a similar sort of style of ship, but smaller. And it's obviously, it can get inside Babylon 5. Interesting, we see that Mr. Morden's very, very keen to stay out of Kosh's way. In contrast to the other ambassadors, he doesn't try to engage him at all. So that's interesting. Meanwhile, Involnova's wing have successfully jumped in towards the Achilles, and she posts 2 ships at the jump gate to watch, to make sure that nobody can get through it without their knowledge, basically. And the Achilles is still on scope, so it's still in one piece, and the rest of the wing burns towards it on full thrust with their weapons on standby, ready for a fight. Back on the station, Kiro is ready to take the Eye home. And notice here actually that they call the lifts transport tubes. That's how they're referred to, so I think that's the appropriate kind of canon term for them on the station. And just as Malari is trying to get in one, Mr. Morden appears. And ironically, Malari asks him what he wants first, before he asks Malari what he wants. And after riding with Malari in the lift and repeating his question as he does, he's once again successful in getting a sort of a deep answer out of the Centauri. And Londo says that he wants the Centauri to reach out their hand and control the stars again. He wants a rebirth of glory for the Empire. And Morden thanks him for his response, and he very much resembles the cat who got the cream at this point. So he's a very sort of oily kind of character, and he does resemble a sort of a salesperson, but he's getting results because he now has responses from 3 ambassadors, one of which he seems particularly pleased with. So we now discover that as Londo is making his way to the Centauri liner with the Eye, the shifty guy's got backup. And he's a good shot, fair play, because between him and his backup, he manages to sort of shoot past all 3 of the Centauri, and both the bodyguards get taken out. And so basically they're in trouble, and he's got his hands on the Eye. So back in the Command and Control Center, Sinclair is putting 2 and 2 together. He's asked for the manifest for the Achilles, and assuming it's accurate, it isn't carrying anything worth stealing, and the ambush that's taking place is much further away from the station than had been the case in the recent past. So he's now concluded that it's a diversion, and he calls Ivanova back and tells her to burn back for the station, basically, and just leave them to it. So Sinclair asks which ships are due to leave shortly, and it's noted that the Centauri liner is due out in 10 minutes. And Sinclair wants Garibaldi's Alpha Wing ready to go as he heads for Bay 12, where the line is going to leave from. And he intercepts Londo's group before they make it into the docking bay area. And of course the raider leader ends up with Kiro as his hostage, and he threatens to try and burn through the station if they try and block the exit. Sinclair makes no attempt to stop him, and says that he'll let him out of the station. And once he's out of earshot, he orders Garibaldi to disable the liner with Alpha Wing as soon as it's clear. And he's also going to shut down the jump gate so that it won't respond to the liner's request to jump. And Lidera says to Londo, who's in the party, rather ominously, that the shadows are coming for Kiro. So we see the nice purple liner leaving again, and it does try to activate the jump gate sequence, but with no joy. Garibaldi, I think it was probably already in space at this point, and he brings his wing out from behind the station to chase it down. So Sinclair, back in scene C, says that the ship is too small to make its own jump point. So quick geeky diversion here, because I'm a bit of a tech enthusiast when it comes to these shows, and let me just outline to you how this works. So ships in Babylon 5 have 2 propulsion systems. They have sort of normal space engines, and they have hyperspace engines, also called jump engines. So only big ships have jump engines due to the power requirements and the complexity, one assumes. And jump engines allow capital ships to open their own jump points without having to rely on a jump gate. So what Sinclair is saying here is that the Centauri liner isn't a big enough ship to have a jump engine, so it can't escape into hyperspace on its own. Okay? Back to the action. Sinclair is confident that they can wait the liner out if need be, and then a blue arrival jump point forms in the station's backyard outside of the jump gate, and it's the Raiders acing the hole, a mothership big enough to carry a jump engine, and a pile of Raider assault ships. Sinclair closes CNC's blast doors, sort of exterior blast doors, and prepares for an attack as the assault ships close in. The defense grid activates and starts targeting the Raider ships, and it might seem like a lot of effort for the Raiders to be going to, but it was established earlier in the episode that the Centauri government paid a very, very hefty sum for the eye. So basically, if they can get their hands on it, they can ransom it back to the Centauri government for an equally hefty sum, and then they'll be doing quite nicely. So Garibaldi's squadron is ordered to stay on the liner, but as it turns out, that's easier said than done, because there are rather a lot of hostile ships in the area. And Londo finds Ladera, who is stood still in the main corridor of the station as others are fleeing around trying to seek shelter, because obviously the station's in a firing line. So Londo collects her as she once again says that the shadows are coming for Kiro and them all. So she's not the most optimistic lady, but she seems very confident in what she's saying, of course, but she's very clearly kind of elsewhere a lot of the time. So as the station rocks from the combat in space, Morden's attempts to evade Kosh come to nothing, and Kosh makes it clear that he is not welcome and must go. Leave now. And the lights go out in the corridor as Morden just silently holds his ground, and then scene shifts again. So the liner makes it through the melee unscathed and docks up with the Raider mothership. Garibaldi shakes a pursuing Raider and goes vertical in space. Yes, it's 3D space combat, folks. Hey, to get a killing angle. And he notes to his squadron that the Raider ships are made for space and air, so they're vulnerable on their airfoils, I guess their wings, which is spot on. It's a big surface to aim at, of course. And very much reminding me of Mambas from Elite, actually, pretty much sort of all the time. So I was totally sold on them as a concept as soon as I saw one of them. Now Sinclair has something else in mind tactically, and he orders the defence grid to be reconfigured for longer range firing, and it has to go offline for them to do that, while Garibaldi pushes the remaining Raiders to the back of the station. And then he closes the box, and Delta Wing jump back in from the jump gate and close in on the Raiders from the opposite direction. And now the Raiders have to run the gauntlet of both the reactivated defence grid firing at them, and Garibaldi's squadron and Ivanova's squadron, both of whom are putting them into a sandwich with the sort of defence grid and the station in the middle, basically. And they're caught in a three-way crossfire, and Delta Wing is ordered to go and chase down the Raider command ship, basically, whilst everyone else deals with mopping up the Raider assault ships. Unfortunately, what jumps in can also jump out once its jump engines have recharged, and the Raiders' mothership's engines have recharged. And Sinclair orders Ivanova not to try and pursue it in case she's caught in the backwash, and it jumps out. So the after-action report from Garibaldi says that 11 Raider ships have been destroyed and 4 were damaged and captured, and their pilots are being interrogated. There are minor injuries and damage to the station, and Kosh's encounter suit has been damaged, but he's not saying how, and he's requested some equipment to repair it with. 3 Star Furies were damaged, 2 were destroyed, 1 pilot managed to eject, and the other one didn't make it, and Garibaldi notes where his family came from and says that he can notify them, but Sinclair says no, he'll do it. So it's a nice little point of detail there, that even the Fury pilot is given a sense of identity, even though we haven't seen him on screen, we don't know him, but he is an individual, and that wasn't lost on me on this rewatch, actually. So Sinclair wants to have a chat with Ladera and Londo about what was on the Centauri liner and why it wasn't declared, because if they'd known about what was going to be on it, then obviously they might have anticipated the attack earlier. And we see that Ladera is getting one of her sort of far off looks, and she picks up a coffee mug, and there's liquid in it, and we see a jump point forming in the liquid in the coffee mug. And I don't know how they managed the effect, because it looks as if it's shifting with the liquid. It's an incredibly impressive effect, and I remember totally buying it at the time and understanding that that was what she was seeing in her vision. And what we now see very clearly is basically there's a double cross happening. So Kiro thought that the Raiders were going to help him overthrow the Centauri Emperor, but actually they're just going to help themselves. And the Raider leader who was on the station explains that these motherships don't come cheap, and it's taken them years to save up and presumably construct or buy this one. But he notes that with the ransom that he'll get for both Kiro and the Eye, they'll be able to afford a couple more, and they're going to keep on hitting Kiro for cash in order for them to stay silent about what he was trying to make them do, of course. So it's completely win-win from the Raiders' point of view. And so, despite the loss of so many fighters, the leader is very happy with life. And although they are very well organised, they're simply not prepared to try and help overthrow a government. Basically, they're big, but they're not that big. But just as they're discussing how this sort of ransom arrangement might work, because basically he's going to need to prove to his government that he's alive before his government will pay up, something emerges into real space right next to the Raider mothership, but there's no jump point, and a purple beam weapon lances out from this thing and basically carves the Raider mothership into pieces. So I really hope they had some insurance, because it sounds like that's going to be rather expensive to replace for them. And back on the station, the Deera's mug falls from her grasp and shatters, which doesn't really help tell us anything about what's just happened, but it's clear that her prophecy for Kiro has just come true, basically. So, and she's seen it happen somehow. So the Deer is now planning to head home, and Londo feels that his career is in tatters, given how much they'd have to pay to get the Eye back again. So he doesn't seem to know the fate of the Raider mothership at this point. And Deera does offer to help, which is good of her, but he says he needs a miracle and anticipates going home a few days after her departure in the morning. And just then, his miracle arrives in the form of Mr. Morden and, quote, friends he doesn't know he has, unquote. And it's a battered carrying case that Mr. Morden had underneath a little sort of blanket, and in the carrying case is the Eye. And Morden vanishes as quickly as he arrived, despite the offer of a fleet of drinks from Malari. So we're left with the distinct impression that we're going to be seeing him again, because obviously he's just bought a massive amount of favour with Malari. we now switch to the male toilets, where Sinclair and Garibaldi are relieving themselves whilst having a little chat about what Garibaldi has found out so far about the Battle of the Line. And I thought that was quite entertaining. I think I half remember that from the first time round, but it's a very natural thing. You know, blokes will have a chat whilst having a wee, and it's, you know, it's just the Babylon 5 way apparently is to do that, and we sort of see them sterilising their hands. I think kind of with a UV kind of light. I can't remember now if there was actually water involved. There might not be, of course, because the station would have limited supplies, I guess. So in the course of this little chat, we discover that when the Minbari supported Babylon 5, they were actually the first ones to sign on to support its construction. And they approved of it on one particular condition, and that was that they had a veto over who the commander of the station was going to be. And Garibaldi explains to Sinclair, as he probably already knew, that it was a plum job. And as a result, there were lots and lots of people who wanted it, and, you know, admirals and like. And Sinclair was way down the pecking order. But the Minbari vetoed everybody until his name appeared. And then they said yes to him. And we still don't know why. We don't know why the Minbari was so keen that he be the commander of the station above lots of more experienced hands. You know, it's got to do, presumably, with the Battle of the Line, but we just don't know why they would single Sinclair out as against anybody else. So just when you thought that was going to be the sort of the conclusion of the episode, we then see Sinclair meeting with Ladera in the departure lounge, and Ladera explains to him that she wants to show him the vision that she's had, and that it's difficult, but she can let him see. And this is why I described her as a telepath earlier on, because I think she must have that sort of level of ability to be able to show him what she now proceeds to show him. And what we see is an Earth transport shuttle just getting clear of the station's docking bay as internal explosions rip the station apart into pieces. And Sinclair asks if this is what's going to happen or what could happen. And Ladera says this is just a possible future, that words, deeds and belief shape the future and change it constantly, and she hopes that he can avoid this particular future. So, this is an incredibly dense episode when it comes to story, and I'm going to sort of just kind of run through some of the what I see as sort of the key points from this, and this will take a little while because there are a lot of them. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that if you had doubts about the series before this episode, this is where they go out the window. Because you just have to stop and consider how much just got crammed into a mid-season episode out of the blue, but of course not out of the blue at all. And this is the interesting thing about Babylon 5. The Raiders have been mentioned and seen several times to this point, and in a sense have had their own sort of mini arc, and they've been shown to be pretty competent, and they've come out on top in some previous engagements, like when Ivanova got owned by them. And here they are clearly being recognised as an operational danger for the station. And we also get to see how they operate internally a little bit. There's obviously a good sort of control structure, and they plan and they invest, and they're really on top of their game. Albeit, as it turns out, not for terribly long, thanks to this episode, because they've now lost their mothership and a whole slew of fighters. And as Garibaldi notes, it's going to take them a long time to come back from this setback. So this is probably the last time there'll be a significant threat for a long period of time. We also have Centauri political intrigue, which goes to reinforce the various close to sort of non-successes over the course of the season, and their own perceived weakness of themselves. In a sense, they are doubting themselves as a power at this point, and if the Emperor was stronger, the underlings wouldn't be plotting a coup against him, nor would Londo express his fervent wish for a stronger Centauri Empire to be reborn, to be going back to the sort of the good old days. So we also have the mysterious Mr. Morden, a very persuasive enigma. 3 sets of questioning, albeit with just one question, and 3 very different responses. And of course, ultimately, someone whom neither Delenn nor Kosh are keen to see on the station. And the subtle intimation that somehow he has damaged Kosh's encounter suit. Not that we know much about its capabilities, but how did he manage that exactly is deeply unclear. And it's not expressly said that he did it, of course, but the last thing we see of Kosh is him facing off with Mr. Morden, so it's not an unreasonable leap. So we see Babylon 5's end, or at least a possible end. There's very little detail around it. We know this is a dangerous place, but we also know that what Ladera saw about Kira's fate was accurate because of the return of the Eye by Mr. Morden. And that also means, of course, that Mr. Morden has some link to the Shadows that Lyra refers to in her prophecies, and that their ships are very unusual, very powerful and very accurate. They had to hit the Raider ship in such a way that the Eye was salvageable in order to gain favour with Londo. I don't know, but I do wonder whether the people that the Centauri hired to find the Eye are also Shadow agents, and that would explain why Morden was listening in on their meeting with Londo, because he knew where to find them, and how they were able to retrieve the Eye again when they blew up the Raider ship. If they, for example, they put a tracker on it, picking it up from vacuum would be much easier, and they'd know where not to target when destroying the ship. So then they could just take the tracker off before returning it if that were necessary. And that would imply more planning than is perhaps confirmed by the episode. But it would mean that Mr. Morden was there more to cement intelligence about the ambassadors, with this being an opportunity if Londo proves to be the best target to develop a relationship with. Jakar's reaction to Morden is similar to Londo's, but it lacks his wider ambition, which seems to rule him out of Mr. Morden's immediate goals. And Delen's reaction clearly comes from a very different place, and given what we know about Minbari, I think it's a little strange that he even bothered, although we know that he's been isolated for a while. And I'm assuming here that Delen's reaction is because she is Sitai, and so he may not have known her standing, and that might explain why he chose to make contact, thinking that she was sort of, a more normal standard, if you like, Minbari. And Delen's reaction as he leaves is very specific, suggesting that she knows that his presence also signifies that they, presumably the shadows, are present. So that it's very, very telling. So clearly there's a whole different backstory going on there that that is only hinted at by this encounter. We also see Sinclair reaching out to Garibaldi for help with a hole in his mind, just as he suggested Garibaldi should do if he got into trouble with drink again, reach out to someone. And Sinclair gets a further indication that the Minbari have a very keen interest in him, but we still don't know what the reason is behind that interest. We just have, a little bit more detail on the link between Babylon 5's construction and the Minbari and Sinclair. So, it's a nice sort of little triangular motif going on there again. But again, this is it's just giving us a little bit more information to go on, but not enough to really let us reach any hard conclusions. And this is, how the show keeps you interested, of course. So all of these threads to varying degrees work because of the way in which the arc has been developed to this point. So as busy as this episode is, it's not overwhelming, I don't think, because it's simply progressing and almost summarising in some ways the information that we've hopefully absorbed so far. So you take it as a standalone and it works, but when you consider how much more you get from it having watched what's gone before, it's treating you as an intelligent watcher, which is brave and hadn't been done before, and of course it makes it harder to sell the series to the casual viewer. Until, of course, you consider that if you like a bit of space-based pew-pew, this episode gives you a whole lot of bang for your 40 minutes of screen time. The rendering farm must have been melting. Just consider the number of shots here. There's the overall tactical plot in space involves a lone Star Fury being overwhelmed by raiders, the retreating Achilles, a Star Fury squadron launching and jumping, the Centauri liner bouncing around, a new capital ship jumping into the local environment, the station and another Star Fury squadron engaging it and its fighters, Ivanova's squadron jumping back in to help mop up, the capital ship jumping out and then returning to normal space, only to be carved up by the shadow vessel. Did I mention Koshi's ship docking back up? So, now, some of that might have been stock footage, but a lot of it wasn't. And it was all really well scripted, really well explained. We understand who's who and what's happening and why. And visually, it's really impressive, with the combat even moving sort of through the station's volume. And in the background, you've got Frankie's score blasting away to set the scene. So, yeah, sure, 20 years ago graphics, they look a little bit dated now. But just like with The Expanse in the modern day, I totally bought this as realistic space combat at the time, and you genuinely didn't know quite what the outcome was going to be. And both Babylon 5 and the Raiders suffer casualties, and that's not ignored in the writing either. And as I mentioned earlier, the Dead Fury pilot is given backstory, so he's not just some sort of nameless red shirt grunt who's been offed. There's been care has been taken in the script by JMS to give him an identity, so that he's not just an expendable gun, basically. So it's a really important touch. And I'm watching these again more closely because as I'm older now, I think I'm appreciating at a different level to my original watch through the actual sort of degree of thought and care that has gone into the scripting of these episodes. And if all of this in just one episode wasn't enough, JMS manages to write humour into it too. So we've got this sort of comedy act with a human evading the warring ambassadors, and then both of them using exactly the same words to each other when basically accusing each other of being a child and saying, "Look what you've made me do." I mean, and I think I referred to them in an earlier episode commentary as sort of Laurel and Hardy, and I do very much get that vibe from them. They just sort of ping off each other beautifully, and it was a glorious thing to watch over the course of the show. And of course, we also have Ivanova's carpet mouth in the morning and her sort of reaction to the overly polite computer system in the morning. And again, it's great foreshadowing because, you know, we probably do that today with our Alexas and the like. You know, other voice assistants are, of course, available. But it's very, very similar to what we would have in the modern day. Now, it wasn't 20 years old back, of course. So, if you're listening to this, and you haven't actually seen this episode, see if you can find it. There might well be video snippets of it here on YouTube. I think it's one of those episodes of the series you can point to and say to someone, hey, watch this. It won't massively wreck any of the earlier episodes for them, but at the same time, I think it does represent a point at which Babylon 5 hit the sort of maturity level as a show that it wanted to hit as it built itself up. And, you know, you get other sort of standalone episodes that obviously won't have this level of intensity, but this one basically has it all. You know, it's just the sort of thing where you just think, what on earth am I watching? Because I did not see that level of sort of action and plotting and sort of interwovenness coming just as a result of having seen what I'd already seen. I knew it was deeper than average, but this was just a whole different ball game, and it was just so completely removed from the very sort of straightforward lines that Trek episodes, you know, have a tendency to take. It's far more nuanced. There's far more humour. You never see anyone go to the toilet in Trek. You do sort of wonder how they do it, but you know, I'm sure it happens. But it's just a totally different feel, which is why I just enjoyed it so much, because it's properly real world, even though it's completely out of this world, literally, obviously. So at this point as well, pretty much everything is in motion now, and the avalanche has certainly begun. So, you know, sorry Pebbles, but it's too late. Now, as an aside and a footer to this this commentary, for the super observant, yes, Mr. Morden's actor, Ed Wasser, was in The Gathering, but he wasn't Mr. Morden in The Gathering. He was playing someone else, okay? So there's no... Although it's slightly confusing because he is the same bloke, he's not the same character, okay? I've also met him. I had to run interference for a couple of ladies at a convention, actually, where it turned out that his catchphrase in real life was, "How you doing?" rather than "What do you want?" And that's another story. If you're still here, thank you. And I'm now in dire need of some liquid refreshment, so I shall leave it there. Until next time, go leave now.